It's heavily influenced by a new reading of that essay shown, which I'm happy to share a bootleg PDF with any of you. So we've been collecting exuberantly, and if we're librarians, we might have been deaccessioning exuberantly, and we've been providing more access than ever before. Exposing collections online sensitizes the world to the importance of the record, and we've been feeding an accelerating circle where access enables visibility, which tends to lead to new acquisitions. And now we're drinking from the digital fire hose and collecting a spectrum of documentation ranging from the deeply personal to the cosmological. This is a great development in human history, although we've not yet imagined the fragrances of amnesia that will inevitably arise in the presence of voluminous memory. And I have a hunch that we're collecting at this breathless rate largely because we can, not necessarily because we should. Eratanzis eloquently asked us to consider for whom and why we preserve in the first place. I would turn the semantic compass a few degrees and ask us to take up the question of why and for whom we collect. In my field, for example, which is moving images, discussions of why archive often circle around an empty center. And I'm not going to go into detail about this, but typically we don't ask that question, and we don't justify our practice. We're content with triumphalist case studies that are geared for public consumption. But now more than ever, we need to make the process of preservation and collecting goal-driven. I hope we won't lose sight of what we want our archives to be in a time when collecting and access decisions may be sometimes dictated by externalities that we don't control. Because regardless of which collections we prioritize, our most important task is to preserve the archives itself. By that I mean preserve the legitimacy of the archival endeavor and keep it from fading away or being starved into oblivion. Jeopardy in many forms is upon us. In addition to climate and cataclysms, there's financial and social precarity, an unsettled social and political climate, public indifference, official or populist hostility, none new dangers, but as they reach a greater scale, they're even more dangerous. Well, one of the archivist's less celebrated skills is the ability to hide, to keep collections safe by staying under the radar. It's dangerous to focus defensively because we exist to be difficult in difficult times. We exist to oppose presentism. We should collect against the stream of dominant opinion, against the stream of power. It's surprising to me how many people accept a reductive view of archives, that we are just organs of power, that we exist to limit free agency. But quite a number of archives exist to provide records, I don't need to tell you this, that may counter consensus to enable historical intervention, and perhaps in the case of the Anthropocene, to enable environmental intervention. So we should both think and collect counter-cyclically, because archives are inherently counter-cyclical, if not already. Archives might see themselves as sites of resistance, and collecting as resistance to amnesia and historical oversimplification, although we still have much to learn about what it really means to resist. But thinking of ourselves in this way turns much of what we do into manifestations of optimism. Now, optimism and privilege often coexist, and optimism may be easier for those of us who have the freedom and resources to move to higher ground. Water can be harder to resist than authoritarianism. I hope to come to New York with collections development scenarios to float for discussion and criticism. But after some reflection, I realized that that was exactly what I should not do, that I shouldn't get into too much specificity at this time until we had conferred and we had provoked one another. But there's still a bunch of things to say. By the way, a great GovDoc that I highly recommend. We've scanned it for your pleasure. So some of us are already experiencing the dangers and constraints we tend to associate with Anthropocene. How are we responding to them? Have we taken the messages of Katrina and Sandy to heart? Many of us are experiencing the difficulty of keeping drives spinning. And we all know of collections without long-term homes, collections rotting in tropical environments, unfunded collections, repositories in political jeopardy. What lessons are there in contemporary experience that we might learn from, especially about business as usual, about sheltering in the same places? We must also be aware of archival traces that signal the onset of the Anthropocene, respond to them, and then collect them. What should we enclose within the protective envelope? Architects use this phrase to describe archival, archival buildings, but there are other dimensions of protection as well. Collections need to be protected, but so does the archival process itself. So do the subjects of records. Archivists of social struggle work hard to protect the identities and profiles of activists whose safety might be at risk, and records may be in political or legal jeopardy. You've all heard about Internet Archive building a mirror in Canada. You will hear from others this weekend on crowdsourcing efforts to preserve research data held in government repositories. And questions, of course, about survivability of digital collections. What kind of protective envelopes do we need? And, excuse me, and which are most likely to succeed? Will we need to plant 1,000 seedlings, knowing that only half 100 may survive? Should we collect for immediate utility, modeling our acquisition and retention policies on a scheme akin to the Whole Earth Catalog? Should usefulness become our prime criterion? How would we define usefulness in an emergency that takes years to unfold? I'm purposely not referring to James Howard Kunstler's misanthropic and racist book, The Long Emergency. A short-term view might be to focus on collections that are actionable, whose preservation seems tied to immediate dilemmas and prospects, but measuring actionability isn't simple. Can we maintain existing collections in the manner to which we're now accustomed, or should we pack lightly for a quick getaway? I'm especially concerned with the destiny of community collections, often located in resource-poor areas. While most of us might agree that communities should own and physically control their cultural assets, what kind of protective envelopes are useful and appropriate to this kind of control? DIY archives, community archives, archives of communities of color, feminist libraries and archives, non-institutional collections, and even some institutional collections who don't know how much support they can muster from their overlords. We've all been thinking about this for some time. Are these kinds of archives more sustainable, or will they be obliged to endure engulfment? Are they equipped to move with their communities? Should they survive, and how could they survive if their communities don't? Not all of us represent established institutions. Can we acknowledge room for individual initiative? Robert Binkley promoted possibilities for independent scholars and archivists. He suggested in the 1930s that individuals could collect where institutions could not. And imagine community-based historical repositories. This is a book on floods, and this is their index of floods. Does it make more sense to work on controllable small projects or huge ones? My hunch is that there's no single solution. We're talking about an ecosystem of collections, not like the ecosystem that presently exists, but an ecosystem capable of adjusting to future needs. Could we elaborate an ecosystem that allows for caves, Svalbard types, centralized repositories, lending institutions, community centers, centralized clouds, oral tradition, Fahrenheit 451 type memory? What about the dangers of centralization? Svalbard, you know, there's been some melting. I think of the Canadian Ice Core repository, which you've heard about. Maybe we should dispense with the drive to collect and centralize. What would that mean? Could we actually deal with distributing authority over valued collections and letting the collections distribute? We'd have to worry about Australian the Australian biohazard people who, you know, burned up the French botanical specimens because they didn't know what they were. We might build cooperatively owned and controlled regional repositories near population centers. Brewster Kahl's decentralized web initiative might be one model, maybe a blockchain registry. Could we maybe develop a labeling system like Creative Commons or Makutu to signal that a particular record holds a high priority for distributed preservation? Then when people touch it, they could grab a copy. Will archives and organizations in different areas fulfill different functions? Will there be deep physical and digital repositories in areas where cheap renewables are available? Will interior coastal relationships start to resemble client-server architecture? Or might we think of restructuring the cultural relations between densely settled and rural areas? Will there be decentralized thin collections maintained for reference and access, with thicker ones hidden away? I think this is already happening in our library system with remote storage and shared print initiatives. Do we want to construct hierarchies of what we should collect? This would seem obviously necessary if the boat is waiting at the dock, but I would suggest that what we're starting to think about now is the beginning of a long process. Yes, we have to plan and collect carefully, but this is a long struggle. We're at a time when science sits in the foreground of our concerns about the future. Does this mean we should place highest priority on collecting and conserving scientific data? But we're also in a time whose key story is one of inequality maintained by violence, and an era that has lasted for some time in which displacement and migration are key, almost universal experiences, where home hides behind diaspora. Does this affect our priorities? Will we be able to care for the records of the Alaskan village of Kivalina when Kivalina is underwater? There will be thousands of Kivalinas. You know, if Google could help at anything, they could start doing a coastal view, take boats around, you know, and start documenting the changing coast. I talked to Google about this, we'll see. And then the trend of record keeping has changed in recent years because institutional records are being created feverishly, but the real growth is in personal archival records. I get this hint from Kim Stanley Robinson in the Mars trilogy, where it turns out that when the Martians try to understand how history broke as it did, they query personal records. They're not querying, really, I show 12 minutes that I've got 3 more than that. There's a few cautions. There's the precedent of the time capsule, where one concentrated repository purports to contain canonical evidence of a civilization. Time capsules aren't about interweaving preservation and access. Instead, they constitute burial without the assurance of disinterment. Their builders make arbitrary inclusion and exclusion decisions that tell their own story in retrospect. They're fascinating, but perfect examples of the way we don't want to build archives or construct histories. Decentralization, an attractive strategy and good but not pure. I think of the progressive, often anarchist-minded regional planners of the 20s and 30s. They believed that cities were dangerous for people to live in, as they indeed were for many, and promoted decentralization as a healthier and more humane alternative. Benton MacKay's Appalachian Trail wasn't originally conceived of as a hiking trail, but a pedestrian spine intended to link self-sufficient, mutual aid-focused communities of young workers along the Appalachian ridges. The New Deal came, and planners were co-opted into government. World War II turned decentralization into a means of distributing factories throughout the landscape so that they couldn't be destroyed by enemy bombing. And after the war, decentralization morphed into state-sponsored urban sprawl, often reinscribing racism into the landscape. There's also a mindset that resembles Cold War civil defense. We may in our mind construct threat scenarios that involve environmental dangers or political antagonists, but we also need to design, and I hate to say this, but around vulnerabilities that arise out of our relations with those closer to us, family and dynastic conflicts, warring flavors of activism, local disputes or factionalisms that become impacted. Our friends can sometimes be more dangerous than our enemies, so that we must make sure that distributed archives don't become warring fiefdoms. We see a little bit of this now. If we take refuge in thousands of holes, let's make sure they are networked and non-competitive. To be a little less dramatic, yes, we should collect what's useful to the future, but we shouldn't get caught up in the trap of pure utilitarianism, because the parts of the record thought least useful have often turned out to be the most actionable as time passes. The most appropriate response to the obliteration or erasure of ecosystems and biota is not to echo with archival erasure or omission, even if the reasons may seem good at the time. Appraisal decisions often look terribly short-sighted only a few years after they're made. I'm not sure that the gravity and the finality of the decisions we may be forced to make in our lifetimes will help those decisions get better. As today, we'll likely be left with what we could do. not necessarily with what we wanted to do. And we've got to be clear to distinguish environmental pragmatism from presentism, seeing the future through the prism of present-day values and concepts. Because to oppose presentism is to resist a facile futurism, to oppose set ideas about what we think will happen. Opportunity. So the permaculture principles, as elaborated by Mollison and Holmgren, I don't take them literally or simplistically, but they're a great framework for thinking about archival work. Permaculture is about encourages using the outputs of one system as the inputs to another. Perfect paradigm for archival work. Ultimately, it rejects the cycle of cultural production that goes produce, distribute, forget, helps us consider integrating archival concerns into the making of culture. Both authorship and archival activity or creative acts need to be recognized as necessary labor. Making and maintaining go together. I want to confess that while I condemn environmental injustices and the relegation of many people to a precarious and dangerous future, the prospect of human adaptation kindles my optimism, because cooperative forms of adaptation are a great opportunity for all species. Humans are also extremely adaptive. Archives and archival workflows can also adapt. Their future contours are far from fixed. We need to reconcile how in our minds a concern for environmental justice and a sense of catastrophism can coexist, because catastrophism can be immobilizing and it can distract us from working towards alternative futures, and alternative futures surround us. Contemporary archival theory right now is at this very moment infused with alternative temporalities. We're seeing this with Afrofuturism, for instance, in what Bethany Novisky calls its counterinsurgencies to inevitability. It would be a pity if we let our awareness of danger give way to catastrophic, fatalistic thinking. This will ultimately turn us into agents of capital, not agents of culture. I didn't do this. This really happened. There's situations where we need to act quickly and with resolution, Hurricane Sandy, but there's chronic solutions as well, where there's time to experiment, see how different ways play out and interact. I need to ask, after some 20 years that digital technologies have been in the mainstream, have we really come to terms with them? If we haven't nailed digital longevity and all of its associated problems, and if MPLP is linked with over-collecting, I'd suggest we're still in the sandbox. I also want to say that loss can be formative. The histories we investigate most eagerly today are often histories of losses that we want to remediate, erasures that we hope to repair. The crime of erasure and the experience of loss can powerfully stimulate the work of artists and historians. While we should never make peace with erasure, we might get better at coming to terms with the inevitability of archival loss. This might not mean welcoming it, but it would mean perhaps accepting its inevitability. I'm not equating this with the need to address over-collecting, but the time is right to minimize the problems we're creating for our descendants. I'll skip this. It's one of the great anti-archival tales. My moral is that we can't look to archives themselves for the clues we need to survive, but to the communities we hope to serve. If archives are to ride the rising waves, it won't be as arcs fully caulked to repel leaks, but as permeable wetlands capable of assimilating ebbs and flows, venues where hospitality is as valued as preservation, where people interact with records and records with people, where past, present, and future transfuse one another. This is our most urgent and exciting purpose. Thank you.
Sorry. Is it this? There's another side here, so I thought that. seems to be doing something. Okay. I don't know how to make this bigger. Thanks everybody for inviting us today. I'm really excited to be a part of this. My name's Nora Almeida and this is Jen Hoyer. We're both librarians, but we are volunteers at the Interference Archive in Brooklyn, which I thought might be important to foreground is in Gowanus, stone's throw from the Superfund site canal. The subject of our talk today is living archives, which we'll define more concretely during the course of our presentation. The definition of living archives is somewhat of a thesis for the discussion that we're going to have here about the relationships between ideas and actions in the context of community archives and in the broader context of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene and socio-political systems are shaped by foundational narratives, and we think it's important to analyze the way that the Anthropocene has been framed, since this framing plays a role in determining how we conceive of the problems that are introduced by climate change and how we respond to those problems. We think that the dominant Anthropocene narrative has been framed as something ideological, as post-political, as mostly disconnected from socio-political reality. And this narrative frames the Anthropocene as an epochal moment that is purely biophysical. And we think that there are a lot of problems with this narrative, both rhetorically and practically. First of all, it's a narrative that's authored by those in power, mostly in Western wealthy countries. And in this narrative, nature is abstracted and disconnected from social systems through several tactics, through political rhetoric, through corporate messaging, through the treatment of the era that we are currently in and the people in it as exceptional, through ideological processes that frame capitalism and technology as neutral, benevolent forces. And we think this narrative obscures relationships between climate change and local, geographically, and culturally specific problems, including some of those that have been raised by the other speakers already: migration, drought, starvation, the displacement of people. We often think of the Anthropocene essentially as a place that is not quite this place, that is kind of outside of history, that has nothing essentially to do with us. And this narrative is problematic in that it ultimately determines, or rather undermines, our sense of agency in the face of environmental crisis. And we think that this narrative problematically has the power to determine political outcomes. So if we interrogate exactly what the current narrative about the Anthropocene is doing, we might find that it conceals who is powerful and how that power is enacted, even as it reveals the power of humans. We might begin to understand nature as something that we are part of locally, that we play a role in creating and defining, and something that is socially mediated. And if we begin to understand environmental change as social change, we might begin to redefine the Anthropocene as an event that is part of a historic continuum of events that we are both implicated in and affected by. So in light of this, we think it's important to reimagine the Anthropocene as something that is composed of many diverse and often conflicting narratives, and diversity in the sense of cultural and social perspectives, but also disciplinary diversity, which I think is represented in this room today, in terms of thinking out solutions to climate change. In this vein, historians Buñuel and Frenzos have argued that we must open up the narrative of the Anthropocene and reflect on representations of the world so that other voices from and for the earth can be heard, coming from other cultures and other social groups, so that other explanations of how we got to this point and other proposals for what is to be done may also have their say.
So as we reflect on this, what we see as a problematic framework that's been used for the Anthropocene, we really believe that scholars, activists, and community members and really archives can play a role in changing narratives around the Anthropocene. But the problem is that we need to make alternative narratives come into play, and that's really where archives have a role. However, we also see problematic frameworks with the way that archives have been viewed, and that they often limit cultural conceptions and power of the space that archives have to enact change. So the task is not only to facilitate a place to document a really diverse and reimagined narrative about the Anthropocene and its consequences, we also need to change narratives about archives, and we need to change cultural expectations about what archives are and what archives can do. We need to rethink our idea of an archive as complete, recognizing the role that gaps and silences also play in telling their own stories. We can recognize the difference between objectivity and neutrality in our profession. And we can recognize that the accumulation and retention of any information is a political act, even if only insofar as to support the status quo. So we believe that a really proactive place to start with these reworkings would be by breaking down barriers between chroniclers and their audiences. The reimagined archive that can rethink the Anthropocene and our relationship to it needs to be a space that's locally grounded and that provides a community with a forum. So we want to reimagine archives as a space for cultural production, social interaction, and human agency.
So we think about this reimagined archive where chroniclers are audiences and audiences are chroniclers as a kind of living archive that is a specific culturally situated place that acknowledges its role in the world and within specific communities, and in these specific communities can be an instigator for new narratives. Beyond this, we also see the concept of living archive as more expansive in that it might describe a kind of way of being, or may describe a definitional or activist strategy that stems from a cross-section of information, community activism, and radical history. And so while there can be many instances of living archives or a way of living archive reflecting local communities and local cultural practices, we want to take this opportunity to more concretely define the concept of implications of the living archive. So we see the living archive as a system in which power differentials can be changed through some of the means that Jen suggested, and through which people can be given agency through performative processes of analysis, exposure to alternative representations of history, and maybe most importantly, interaction with others in intersecting communities. And we see the implications of this system that the living archive has the potential to interfere with social, political, environmental structures that affect our ecology, and to prompt political action and activism that is culturally grounded. So essentially, we view the living archive as a generative space, which stands in contrast to most conceptions of archives as inert, nostalgic, or connected to the past. We think of the living archive as future-oriented and operating in a post-nostalgia space because our understanding of history and where it leads us is shaped and curated by archives. This shaping very much determines the future. This curation happens for the future. That is the point of the archive, to save stuff for the future. And information professionals have an obvious role to play in determining what is saved, which narratives are preserved, whose voices are heard, and also how these narratives are presented. And as a result of this, we can think about the archive as an affective rather than neutral space, and as having the ability to affect and also to document the emotional impact of history as opposed to just the bare facts of history. And in this way, perhaps, the archive has always been a kind of space for cultural production. We just seldom kind of think of it in this way.
So I'm going to talk a little bit now about Interference Archive and the work that we do there because we think it plays out as an example of a living archive. As Nora mentioned, Interference Archive is in Brooklyn, New York, in the Gowanus neighborhood. It's completely volunteer run and collaboratively organized. We're an open stacks archive of social movement ephemera, material produced in multiple for widespread distribution. And so that means that we actually collect a lot of material in formats that may not be collected in other archives. As an archive, we see ourselves as a social space. We have a reading room, an exhibition gallery, and an event venue. We are community funded, which means while we receive some small grants for special projects, our operational costs are covered largely by individual donors who sign up to give a bit of money every month. So first, we think it's important to be conscious of the space that an archive takes up, to understand an archive's role within a community and a neighborhood, to understand our place both with regards to localness and with regards to creating space for multiple narratives, and to understand the way an archive promotes individual or collective agency. We talked a little bit, Nora and I, about who our community is, and we realized that as an archive, our community is really built on conversations with people who feel connected to the work we're doing. And so our collection policy, collecting material produced by social movements, produced in multiples for widespread distribution, plays a really large role in defining our community. The community of interference archive is people who visit our archive and see themselves in our collection, or they see gaps in our collection and recognize that they can fill those, or they see a space for historic material that they've collected. And so that in this sense, we are very much a community in which typically disparate communities can be co-located. It's really important to highlight the role of an archive in validating individual and collective history and promoting the agency of individuals represented in its collection. Even if that is not a goal that an archive sets out to accomplish, it's a thing that an archive achieves. And so as we think about the ways we have interacted with the history of specific communities that are part of our neighborhood, we have a couple of concrete examples. In 2015, we put together an exhibition called We Won't Move, the history of tenants organizing in New York City, within the context of the real rent reform campaign here in New York around the renewal of New York City's rent laws, and in collaboration with 12 tenant organizing groups from across New York City, who contributed information about their biggest organizational accomplishments historically, as well as their current campaign goals looking forward. And we've been involved in other anti-gentrification work and conversations, including one Nora took part in at the Brooklyn Museum. And then we do a lot of fun things in the neighborhood, like block parties, and we work with other neighborhood artists, like Radio Free Gowanus, our local pirate radio station, to highlight issues going on in our neighborhood and highlight the displacement of artists and groups like us in our neighborhood. So in this way, we recognize that the ongoing problems in our neighborhood, namely gentrification, that space problem, and is very real for us as an archive, and it's something that we need to and are willing to wrestle with. We also see that archives are a place for fostering dialogue across time and space, and through the co-location of various historic narratives, we see archives playing a really big role in enabling the continuity of cultural production. So the archive's physical arrangement in our archive consists of organizing material by format, and then within format usually by topic. And so what this means is when I go to a poster file, I find a folder of posters from anti-abortion movements across decades. And just by flipping through that folder, a new narrative has been constructed. And the viewer learns something new from the conversation that these items create just by being co-located with each other. We also facilitate continuous cultural production through our propaganda parties, which are an event where we produce material from current artists that is inspired by material in our collection and related to current issues, and we invite people to come and take it away for free. And then we collaborate with a lot of other creative organizations that draw on our archive for inspiration, both from the graphic material in our collection as well as the ideological material that we give access to. So groups like the Just Seeds Artists Cooperative, Mobile Print Power, an intergenerational print collective in Queens, Combat Paper New Jersey, Willie Mae Rock Camp for Girls, some local youth film initiatives like Youth FX and Real Works, the Groundswell Mural Arts Program, and the New York Writers Workshop. The archive is not an isolated repository, and it needs to be understood as a center for social interaction. However, the work of changing that conception is not easy. People do not intuitively think that it would be fun to go and hang out in an archive. So we have to do a lot of work very intentionally to, largely through our programming, to break down barriers between archival material and cultural knowledge and mainstream understandings of the world. So this photograph illustrates one of the Wikipedia editathons that we've done. This is a really fantastic process that we've found for disseminating archival information into mainstream knowledge resources. We also have reading groups and podcasts, and then we produce exhibitions and exhibition publications that, more than being an exhibition catalog, are really a resource for the community. And those exhibitions give us a lot of opportunities to have really fantastic conversations with other, maybe other communities that surround us. One thing that I find really interesting and a little bit difficult as a librarian and archivist is how much the art world gets really interested in our exhibitions, and there's something in me that resists a bit of the objectification, but then speaking with Art in America and Art Forum gives me an opportunity to talk about archival material and some of these historic narratives with a community that otherwise might not have been terribly interested. So all of that to say, this all led us to a couple of questions. You know, the Interference Archive is one example of what we think is a living archive, but there are a lot of larger questions that our library and archives community needs to be asking related to institutionalization, exclusion, funding, and power. And these questions: how can counter-narratives be instituted through alternative archives? How can archival structures be changed in order to accommodate content that has until now been excluded from archives? How can the archive make sure marginal voices are not silenced or erased? And what practices can archives adopt to be intentional about what the archive produces? We need to remember that the archive is for the future, essentially. And I'll just wrap up by saying we made a zine that is really an annotated bibliography of all the reading we did to get to this place.
It's called the Anthropocene.
We feel real clever about that.
I was like, you know, we're calling this the Anthropocene, right?
And so we have copies of those.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I guess we should also say that at 5 p.m. at the end of today's session, if anybody wants to come to the archive, we can do a tour and hang out. We'll just leave directly from here. Jen has to go to the archive.
Well, I really apologize. I have to run immediately to meet an exterminator because, in spite of climate change, some species are not endangered yet. So I'm going to do that, and then I will meet you all at Interference Archive, or all of you who decide to come, so you should find Nora at 5.
Yeah, so if out-of-towners need help navigating the weekend subway system, I'm happy to facilitate that.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Oh.
No, I can just keep building and see everything.
I'll put these at the table. I don't know if we have quite enough, but I'm happy to send you a PDF.
No, they're not really. I didn't add the notes. I might bring you back up to pull up the video. Okay, I am not an archivist. My name is Jill Kubit, and I am the co-founder and the director of a project called DearTomorrow, which I have been building with a number of really amazing people over the last 2 years. And I'm here to give the utopian kind of perspective about taking action on climate change. So the problem a number of people have addressed about how people talk about climate change is that, in the last 10, 20, 30 years, we really haven't talked about it in a way that makes sense to people and that really motivates people to be active. Certainly, some people are moved by reading an article that says, we're at 410 parts per million. But for most people, it's too data-driven, it's too scientific. It's really difficult kind of to understand the challenge that we face. And it's, you know, we just really haven't defined climate in a way that, you know, connects with people's identities and values. We kind of ask people to take on the environmental values and not shape it in a way that actually connects with how people live their day-to-day lives and the priorities that they already have. And so these are kind of some of the core issues around why climate change communications has not worked. And so about 2 years ago, I founded a project where we've created a digital platform where people can write letters and submit videos and photos about their willingness to take climate change action and to kind of explore how they feel about climate change and you know what they kind of imagine for the future. And so it's a website. Anybody can participate in the project. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my backstory and how I kind of came to this project. So, as you may have guessed, I'm a parent, and I've been working on climate change since around 2006. And during that time, for the first 7 or 8 years, I spent much of the time working in the trade union movement on climate change, trying to think about how to engage people, communities, workers, large organizations to really prioritize climate. And there was, you know, we would have a whole bunch of different narratives that people would talk about. People would talk about, you know, the importance, the kinds of jobs that would be created in a shift to a low carbon economy. People would talk about the health benefits of making a transition away from fossil fuels. And various communities over a period of time have taken on various narratives about why we should make a transition, but it's still very much up in our heads about why we should make a transition. And so I had this very personal experience of, you know, working in the field and working with I work with lots of activists, I work with scientists, I work with workers, coal workers, you know, who are in the field and worried about their jobs. I work with a whole bunch of different people. And, you know, I study like the urgency of the issue and the crisis and the time frames to which we have to make a transition. And it always felt really distant. Even though I'm in the field, you know, I understand what we're going through. It's like, you know, something has to happen by 2050 or by 2020. It's all very much in, you know, in the future for me. And it's something that I can't really relate to. And then in 2013, I had a child, and I really started thinking about what his life was going to look like as he was actually growing up during this next period of time. And I began to imagine, you know, that the year 2020 was the year he would be in first grade, and that, you know, and I just had this, like, the year 2030 is when he graduates from high school, and it completely shifted my time frame of how I really thought about the urgency and how I personally thought, even though I'm already working on it, how much more personal and important the issue became for me. And this experience also happened at a time when I met my co-founder, who was a behavioral scientist and climate change communicator, and she was also a new mom. And she also was thinking about how do we engage people. And so she wrote a letter in the October of 2014 to her daughter to read in the future. And she found it to be a very profound experience for her. And the two of us got together and thought, you know, if other people could actually stand in the future and imagine themselves talking to the present, to somebody that they actually know and love and care about, could we begin to make climate change much more of a personal and relevant issue for people? And could we provide a space or a platform for people to share their stories? And so the DearTomorrow project was born. And, you know, a lot of times we get like, oh, it sounds great, you know, you guys are moms, like this, it's, you know, it's kind of like rainbows and butterflies. But it actually, you know, the literature that's out there in behavioral science and climate change communication does show that legacy is a very powerful driver of getting people to think about their own actions in taking on more pro-environmental behavior. And we also decided to design the project so that, we were using things that we know that resonates with people and that does, get people interested and engaged. And so the whole project is based around individual people and individuals and organizations telling stories, very kind of personal stories about, why this issue is important to them, what they hope for the future, and what they hope to do by themselves and also kind of collectively. And I can talk a little bit more about, what's kind of in the letters. But so we're not just taking the idea of like a lot of climate change campaigns, they say, well, you should do this, you should use trusted messengers, which is like your friends and family and your social networks are really the only people who are actually going to listen to you. But they kind of tack it on to the end of a campaign. Like they do all this work and then they say, okay, now we're going to get our communication strategy to try and reach people. And we decided to design this project so that the core of it is around kind of using and engaging these best practices. And the thing that's like, that I think's the third part that, really interests me is that because it's a digital platform, we can grow and scale this project without a lot of money. And I'll talk about how we kind of envision to grow that project. And so, as the main person and as the director, these are kind of all the things that I've had to think about when building a project, because you're basically taking an idea and you're trying to make it a thing. And so, it's building a website, figuring out what is the communication strategy, how do you brand it in a way that resonates with people, how do you get people to actually to do the project and then to learn from what they're actually doing and then changing it as you go. We've had to raise money because I was working on this for about a year and a half full time with no pay. And then, partnerships, media strategy. So there's a ton of things to think about. So if anybody is really interested in building kind of their own living archive, I'd be happy to talk more about that. And we've had a number of successes. We have raised almost $200,000, which is really hard, but I'm really proud of. But the thing that I think is most interesting about the project is this ability to scale. And you can scale things in two different ways. One is having digital reach and having exposure to a lot of people through social media and media. Another way to really scale something is to build kind of a franchise model where other people and other organizations are doing the project basically for you. And so we, through our experience, found out that there were actually people that have done this project on their own without contacting us. And we didn't really realize it until we had our first website, and it was really clunky. It had lots of problems, and it required us to do a lot of the back end work. Someone would write something, and then we'd have to physically transition it to like another site. And we decided to automate it. We got some money, and we automated it and rebuilt the website. And when we did that, we started tracking people in terms of like where the letters were coming from and the photos. And we would find like on one day, like 15 letters would come from the same community, and we have no connection or contact with anyone there. And so, then we'd reach out to the organizers or figure out, somebody organized this. And we're still a pretty small project. We have about 600 participants at this point, but we've had at least a dozen people who have from all around the country who have just decided like, I'm gonna do this project in my community or in my school, and then they just give it to us without us doing any outreach. And so that's something that I think that gives me like a lot of positive kind of hope. I know that's a bad word, but that something like this will actually kind of work. And so then I wanted to share a couple of quotes from people so you get a sense of what people are writing. This was a really interesting letter written by a woman named Joy Latt, and she submitted this. It was like in the last summer. And one thing, I'm going to read a quote, but one thing that was really interesting about this letter is that half of the letter, she talked about what it's like to raise 2 black boys during this period of time, with Black Lives Matter and with a lot of the police brutality, and then half of her letter was about climate change and her activism on it. And it was super interesting to see that how other issues get weaved into the cultural narratives that people have. And so we basically have provided this space for people to write about whatever they want. And we've seen that those narratives are very, they're very rich and kind of unique to people, but they also change over time, depending on kind of what's happening currently, politically especially. So Joy Latt writes, "It's an act of love to you and everyone who comes after. I really could not live with myself if I let an act of injustice as big as leaving you an unlivable climate happen and didn't do everything I could do to possibly stop it." And she wrote a really very beautiful letter. And then this is Ben and his brother, and he wrote a really beautiful letter as well, and I have to pull it up actually. And he wrote this. He was an organizer in Kansas City for the recent climate march, and he wrote I also thought he wrote a very beautiful letter. Talking about kind of his own personal struggles around kind of what to do. And so he's talking about what he and his brother have done. He says, "We mitigated our personal carbon footprints by forgoing meat and riding bicycles to work. We wondered about how we might be able to eliminate plastics from our daily routines and recycle literally everything. We were amazing, you should have seen us. Now and again, though, we wondered if these were the right questions to be asking. To ride a bike for political reasons, however fun and correct, still seems like a privileged position compared to those we saw at daybreak, pedaling down the sidewalks on cheap bikes, ball caps pulled low over puffy eyes, or even compared to the beat-to-hell Saturns from the Far East neighborhoods. Farmers markets, CFLs, and reusable shopping bags became symbols dripping with class and racial tension." And this is a letter from Jenny Malala. These are all kind of letters I like, so there's not like a big, they all kind of connect to each other. Jenny, what's the time on this?
Just at 5.
Okay. Jenny Malala is a coral reef researcher, and she writes, "To my dear son, it's 2017 and I'm getting ready for my next coral reef research trip. I've been lucky to work on reefs around the world over the last 20 years. I can't wait until you're old enough to come with me and be my dive buddy. You're only 3 now, and you have to be 10 and a good swimmer before you can scuba dive with me." And then she goes on to say, she talks about the coral reefs turning white and how her child can't see because this is all happening underwater. And then she says, "I have to admit I'm wondering where I will take you to dive for your first time. I want it to be a healthy reef with amazing underwater life, big fish, turtles, manta rays, and even a friendly shark or two. But the answer is that I just don't know what reefs will be left. I hope I will be able to take you diving in all the incredible places I have visited. I know they can recover." And I spoke to her about her letter, and she said that one of the hardest things for her as a researcher was really to think about this thing that she loved so much and she dedicated her whole life to, and not being able to share that with her own child. And how, when she was telling me that, I was like, we were both kind of getting all misty-eyed, and it's this idea of having places and things that we love that are really at risk, and we know that there are much bigger kind of issues around the struggle for water and for food and mass migration and kind of the horrible apocalyptic scenes, but there's also something about like losing our culture and losing part of ourselves, and also kind of imagining what our own children and our grandchildren's kind of world is going to look like. Just really quick, in addition to the letters, we've started collecting videos, and we also have an easier ask, because we found that we have about 450 letters, but the letters are a real commitment from people, and we know they're not necessarily easy. We have people who have told us they heard about the project 6 months ago. It took them 2 months to get up the courage to sit down and write it, or it took them 3 weeks to actually write something. But what people have submitted is a really beautiful kind of personal and also kind of historical glimpse into how people think about climate change. We also have this easier kind of ask that organizations and people can do kind of in groups, which is asking people to make a public commitment around taking more action in their lives. And we're trying to get people to think not only about what they can do in their home, but how they can be more politically active and involved in their communities, and kind of shift kind of the way people think about action from kind of the very kind of personal, I'm going to change my light bulbs, to I'm going to show up, I'm going to vote, I'm going to be more publicly engaged. And I have one more slide, but I'm going to forego it because we just released a new video. So I'm going to show it to you because it's our Mother's Day video. And I'll just introduce it a little bit. I posted this last night. This is a compilation of from an organization where they had their organizers and all of their leaders do the project, and they submitted so many beautiful letters that we actually put it together into one kind of cohesive letter, and we put together this video. And so in addition to just having the letters, there's all of these other opportunities out there in terms of radio, magazines, community, like live readings, videos, to kind of use this material and get it out there to the broader public. Should I do it? It's not. It's not.
This letter is for you.
Yeah, start over.
Dear Tomorrow, Dear Tomorrow, I am writing this letter from the past. This letter is for you, your future, and your future children I hope to meet someday.
The day you were born, it was love at first sight.
I looked into your eyes. I knew I would do anything to protect you.
Protecting you means more than ensuring your short-term survival. It also means ensuring that you'll have a safe planet to live on.
I pledge to do everything I can to protect you.
I will work every day to combat climate change.
It means speaking up, taking action, voting, mobilizing others.
But I cannot achieve change alone. No one can.
I believe in the power of the collective.
I am trying to get people to do more, to ask for more, to demand more.
We will be the change we want to see in the world.
We will be good stewards and will demand the same from leaders. We have the solutions.
When you read this letter, it may seem like that was a long time ago.
Remember, this is your home.
Our Earth is your child now.
Don't be afraid to fight for it, stand up for it, and take care of it and each other.
And live each day for the present moment, because this is all we have.
My dear, I love you more than you could ever know.
are worth every effort.
Now go outside and breathe clean air. Love you always.
With all my love, eternally yours, Mama, your mom.
With all my love, your mama.
I know my time is up, but I have one last thing to say, which is that we currently do not have an archivist on our team. And we do have big plans for this project. And you know, I have visions of this being in, you know, the MoMA or, you know, major institution, or being held at a major university. And we do have a vision to kind of have this collection for a period of time and then close it down, and then we will reopen it so that the recipients and the future generations can actually see this. And you know, we've been talking to like art galleries and lots of different groups about how we could use this material. So if you are an archivist and you're interested, please talk to me about potentially, you know, getting involved in the project and helping us think through what the archive could look like. Thank you.
Oh, really? I'm sorry.
This one here, right? I don't use this that much. Is it this side? Thank you. I think I should be okay. Hi everyone, and my name is Aruna Magier. I'm the South Asia librarian at NYU's Bob's Library. And I want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share my paper with you and also learning from all of you here. So the title of my paper is, can you all hear me? Yes. Thank you. The title of my paper is Water, Land and Forests, Documenting India's Environmental Activism. So this paper outlines one methodology for selecting, collecting, archiving, and making broadly accessible the documentation of environmental activism in India. Focusing on reports from Indian activist and advocacy NGOs, typically distributed online, it highlights the ephemeral nature of this documentation and a collaborative framework for creating a lasting archive serving the needs of multiple stakeholders. Before outlining the methodology developed at NYU libraries for selecting, collecting, archiving, and making broadly accessible this kind of documentation, it's useful to briefly survey a range of environmental threats generated by human activity in India that are impacting the natural resources of the country, such as water, air, land, and forest, as well as the activism and protests that have arisen in response to these threats and their impacts. Most of this ecological damage is seen as connected to or directly caused by the government's aggressive economic development agenda, as well as the proliferation of expansive domestic and foreign investment corporate projects that cause displacement of people, loss of livelihoods, damage to wildlife, pollution of environment, and much more. The protests come from individuals who are directly affected by this kind of development-induced displacement and environmental disruption, including farmers, forest-dwelling tribal communities, slum dwellers, and urban populations, and many other civil society constituencies. Resulting eco-activist social movements then coalesce around leaders who are passionate about protecting the lives of people and their habitat, and their grassroots organizations, NGOs, civil society networks, women's self-help, and advocacy groups, etc., that they create. Examples of negative impacts of human activity on the water ecology of India include the rapidly increasing use of plastic packaging in modernizing in India, with discarded plastic a major source of pollution in India's waterways. Likewise, economic development has brought with it the widespread use of chemical fertilizers that leach into the soil and result in toxic agricultural runoff into rivers and streams. Government-sanctioned land grabs for development of major industrial development projects produce their own component of chemical and industrial waste polluting India's waters. As a result, even larger portions of India's urban and rural populations, particularly the poor ones, are experiencing inadequate access to clean drinking water. Large-scale redirection of riverine and marine water causes its own varieties of ecological disruption, as we all know. Construction of dams for big hydroelectric projects forces the uprooting of entire communities whose livelihoods depend on the land, water, forests surrounding them. Clearing of mangrove forests for shrimp aquaculture or to reclaim land for agriculture, harbor construction, industrial development, and human settlement produces its own cycle of ecological damage in India and in South Asia. Overfishing in oceans and rivers leads to depletion of fisheries and resulting imbalances in marine ecosystems. Land is another endangered component of the environment in India. For example, aggressive expansion of mining, particularly coal mining and other extractive industries, leads to soil erosion, sinkholes, contamination of soil, and polluted topsoil washing into streams. Of course, the burning of fossil fuels like coal, especially in massive quantities as in coal-fired power plants, also pollutes the air, creates atmospheric disturbances like the long-standing toxic smogs that hover in Indian cities and sicken the population and contributes directly to global warming. The spread of irresponsible farming practices, the pushing of chemical fertilizers and hybrid and genetically modified seeds into the mainstream into the agricultural mainstream are causing biological and ecological destruction and loss of biodiversity. In parts of India, rural electrification has electrification has led to the widespread use of pumps with deep tube wells to bring much more irrigation water to the surface and to force a short-term increase in agricultural productivity. But this over-extraction of groundwater has disturbed the water table, in many cases leading to irreversible salinification and desertification of previously arable land. Combined with the disruption of previously reliable seasonable precipitation patterns resulting from climate change and global warming, these human-generated phenomena have had very severe impacts on the ecosystem with dire social consequences. Drought, indebtedness, widespread grinding poverty among the farmers, many of whom come from socially exploited castes, has stricken many rural areas, ultimately leading to a mass phenomenon of Indian farmer suicides. Forests in India have always been a vital resource for the subsistence of rural people throughout the country and especially in the hill areas, as they provide food, fuel, and fodder to the inhabitants, and also because they protect and stabilize soil and water sources. But Indian forests have been abused and their habitat has been affected badly by ecological destruction caused by irresponsible development and wanton deforestation, leading to displacement of numerous forest-dwelling tribal communities, loss of habitat, and resulting endangerment of wildlife species. Poaching, animal skin trade, and illegal smuggling have only exacerbated these trends. In India, as in many developing and poor countries, ecological destruction of these that I just described above, water, land, air, and forest, goes hand in hand with the development-induced social and economic description. The result is often social movements, protests, resistance, activism, and the rise of organizations to address these needs. So now I'll give some contemporary examples of environmental protests and activism in India. Most recently, in response to extended droughts destroying their lives, there were very strong and striking protests led by farmers from the state of Tamil Nadu in South India, demanding a drought relief package from the central government, including also farm loan waivers and establishment of a central government board to manage the relief system. They staged a protest for 41 days at the state government level, refusing to end their agitation despite repeated requests by government officials. And I quote what they said. Farmers are committing suicide. We are saying don't turn us into skulls too. We are standing here as Adi Dravidiyas, as Dalits are known in Tamil Nadu. We are downtrodden. We are half naked. We are not demanding. We are begging the government to save us from starvation and death. So this is, one direct impact of climate change on ecosystem and livelihoods. And another quick example is in a high-profile case, a 9-year-old girl has filed a public interest lawsuit against the government of India for failing to take adequate action against climate change, pollution, and environmental degradation in India. This is very recent. And also in the states of Chhattisgarh and Odisha, tribal communities, NGOs, and other grassroots activist groups have launched large-scale protests against the fast-paced growing incursion of coal mining projects in their region. So these are just a few examples. And then I want to move on quickly to the historical social movements, because these are contemporary, but in India, protest against environmental damage and to protect people's lives that are affected by an environmental destruction has long history. So one is Chipko movement. The word Chipko comes from the Hindi word meaning to stick, to hug, or to embrace. In order to save the trees from being chopped down, the men and women of the villages decided to hug the trees and bring their bodies in between the axe and the tree. Quote, embrace the trees and save them from being felled. The property of our hills, save them from being looted. Unquote. It was to protect the forest in the then Uttar Pradesh hills from being cut down by commercial agents that in 1970s and 80s, Chandi Prasad Bhatt started a peaceful revolution and supported by Sundarlal Bahuguna by following the Gandhian method of satyagraha or non-violent resistance. In this movement that came to be known as the Chipko movement, the efforts of Chandi Prasad Bhatt in making the villagers realize their strength in organizing them to protest non-violently and in protecting the environment were recognized by international communities also. So that is one. And the Chipko movement slogan was ecology is permanent economy. And then another movement is Silent Valley. Silent Valley movement. Silent Valley occupies an area of 8,950 hectares at an altitude of 3,000 feet in Palakkad district in Kerala, southern India. It is surrounded by Nilgiri, Attapadi and other forests. The Kerala state government decided to construct a massive hydroelectric dam project in the Silent Valley for the generation of 120 megawatts of electricity in 1976. The proposed dam would store 270 million cubic feet water in a reservoir, spreading over 700 hectares and submerging the whole valley. Sugata Kumari led the iconic nationwide movement known as the Save Silent Valley to rescue some of the oldest natural forests in the country from the jaws of industrialization. So she went on to become the founder of one conservationist NGO called Prakriti Samrakshana Samiti, and she worked with other NGOs also. Eventually, in 1983, the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi accepted the recommendations of top scientists and declared the Silent Valley as Biosphere Reserve, cancelling the hydroelectric project proposal of the state government. Thus, the activist NGOs succeeded in protecting an important reserve. Sorry. And then the other one is Narmada Bachao movement or Andolan. Narmada is the largest west-flowing river arising from the Amarkantaka Plateau in Madhya Pradesh. This river travels 1300 kilometers, draining 9.88 million hectares between Vindhya and Satpura mountain regions. The state government initiated a gigantic plan. The Narmada Basin Development Program involves construction of 31 large dams for Narmada and many more hundred medium dams and minor projects. The benefits were projected as millions of hectares of land irrigated, etc. But according to NGOs, massive damming of Narmada River could be a blueprint for disaster. NGOs led by environmentalists like Medha Patkar organized a sustained movement to stall the projects of Sardar Sarovar and Narmada Sagar dams and have met with partial success. So the last one I want to talk about, the historical, which is also like ongoing one, which is called Bija Satyagraha. In 1998, opposition was launched against Monsanto company, and the Monsanto Quit India campaign was initiated by various farmers organizations and NGOs including Navadanya and the Karnataka State Farmers Organization. This movement was called the Bija Satyagraha, which means non-violent action against seeds, modeled on Gandhi's philosophy of non-violent civil disobedience. There was a call by the KRSS, the Karnataka State Farmers Organization, for direct action by farmers against Monsanto's biotechnology. Operation Cremation Monsanto was also launched. Vandana Shiva, an active environmental activist, she also championed farmers' rights. She also worked for, she still works for ecofeminism, and I'm skipping quickly. The rejection of corporate patents over seeds like Monsanto, Vandana Shiva calls them seed freedom. So this is another, big ecological movement that met with great success in India. So besides the selection of specific movements described above, India has seen the blossoming of many diverse grassroots organizations, advocacy groups, and NGOs. I'll give just names of a few. One is Aranyak. It is in Guwahati, northeast state of India. Guwahati-based NGO organization, and they work for preservation and restoration of environment and related issues. And then we also have Center for Climate Change and Adaptation Research Center and Goa Foundation in Western India, Goa, and they are a very active environmental action group. And of course, Navadanya, the one I mentioned just when I was talking about the Bija Satyagraha, Navadanya is organic and GMO-free movement, and they work for against chemical agriculture and genetic engineering. The movement is now spread to throughout India through their partner organizations and farmers networks. Navadanya literally means 9 seeds, symbolizing protection of biological and cultural diversity, and also the new gift, dana in Indian language, it means also giving as gift. In today's context of biological and ecological destruction, seed savers are the true givers of seed. The gift or dana of Navadanya's 9 seeds is the ultimate gift. It's a gift of life, of heritage and continuity. Conserving seed is conserving biodiversity, conserving knowledge of the seed and its utilization, conserving nature, conserving sustainability. This is what Navadanya stands for. So, and then there are a couple more, but I don't want to run out of time before I go to the documenting and archiving part. So before I come to documentation and the rationale of why we should collect them, I also want to give you a quick update of what government is doing in the middle of all this, So one is very recently, I think it's last year, October 2016, India signed the climate change agreement, the Paris Accord. It signed and it agreed to fulfill the requirements required by the Paris Agreement. And also, Indian government is like making efforts to reduce air pollution in Delhi, and also they have actually Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change is actively engaged with environmental aspects of India, and also they have a national action on climate change plan. So this is on one hand this is happening, and on the other hand, recently there are news items that highlight how Indian government is shutting down many NGOs that are working for environmental activism in India, and even the Greenpeace was banned from India. So just 2 minutes or 5 minutes? Oh, really? It's not. Oh, I didn't know that. So yeah, government is doing some of this, and also they did two of the things, which is giving, according to rivers in India, Ganges and Yamuna, the status of human beings. On doing that, again, it's like, religion and also protecting environment. So I'll quickly go to the other part, whereas documenting rationale for collecting it. Can I take like 5 minutes, please? Because this is.
We'll have questions and answers. You can add more.
Okay. So I thought we all have 20 minutes, no? Oh, so I took up that much, sorry. Documentation, environmental degradation, I talked about it, and so I'll just highlight. In carrying out this work, advocacy groups, organizers, and practitioners are creating and using various kinds of documentation to support the causes that they are working for, to highlight and publicize their work, and to reach out to their target communities. If we librarians and archivists, environmental activists, practitioners, and stakeholder communities do not begin to work together to take action now to preserve and information sources that are generated in the course of this activity, they will surely disappear soon. This loss would not only negate the operational potential of the power that information provides, but would also deprive the impacted communities of the historical context of the struggles that they are engaged in. So in this particular example, I wanted to actually show you, give you a small demo of what I collected here at NYU Libraries, which is just a subset of the NGO websites, which is the research reports or their annual reports that they create. It's not the whole website, but just the research reports that are mainly produced in PDF format. So I worked with at NYU Libraries, I worked with my colleagues, and they created for me a special DSpace facility in our faculty digital archive, where I could identify, select thematically NGO reports, and I could add them to our faculty digital archive. Even though it's faculty digital archive, it also has librarian collections part, where I was able to preserve South Asian document PDF records. So that is one part, preservation is done, but access is another part. So I also worked with my colleagues, and I profoundly thank my colleagues who are not here, but they are from our tech services, who made an arrangement for these records that are preserved in the faculty digital archive DSpace to be reflected in our online catalog, Bobcat. And that is one part, only NYU people can see that. But the ultimate goal is to get them accessible to everyone. And this, I was looking at it as collaborative library project, whereas all these libraries, who are doing archiving of this kind of thing, for example, the South Asia librarians, they can pick up this thematically or region-wise, and there would be less duplication, but these that are important things would be preserved, because these are endangered because of political systems and instability of web systems itself. So very recently, they also provided the facility where These records are also linked to WorldCat, so anyone can see them, and then they can omit what are already being done and take up different things. So that is how we can make them scalable also. So I think thanks everyone, and thank you. Sorry I had to, thank you.
I am not using slides, so I'm good. Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Ben. Hi. I'm going to talk about that most elusive of utopias, archival appraisal. All right, this is not how my voice normally sounds too, sorry. So perhaps my experience is not unusual for children of the 1980s, but I did not enter adulthood with a very broad awareness of environmental issues. Raised with privilege in the yuppie suburbs of Los Angeles, first child to Midwestern conservative parents, I did not have direct exposure to progressive thought through the filter of my parents' pre-internet media diet, which included a family subscription to the Limbaugh Letter. Environmental concerns of my childhood, acid rain, for example, or saving the dolphins, were openly mocked in my household, and the nature writing and environmental literature I read as an undergraduate in college was my first inkling of something more. But it took some time for my worldview to evolve, my environmental values to form, and for my choices in life to be derived from those values. By the time I understood the gravity of our environmental crisis, my professional path as an archivist was fixed. So as a library graduate student, I attended the ALA conference shortly after the birth of my second child, and I visited the booth of Chelsea Green, a publisher of sustainability books. And after a long conversation about climate change and the environment, the publisher asked me why the hell I was training to be a librarian. You should be on the front lines of this fight, she told me, and she was right, and her challenge still kind of gnaws at me. Throughout my career, I've really struggled to understand how my professional role as an archivist might contribute effectively to a societal response on climate change. And though it doesn't quite seem enough, I guess this presentation is my sort of long simmering attempt to answer that question, one attempt anyway. Penn State climate scientist Michael Mann has said that because of climate change, our future as a species inevitably will include some combination of adaptation, mitigation, and suffering. How much and in what combination is yet to be decided by us. This uncertainty is profoundly troubling to anyone who thinks too long on it, as I don't even need to tell you. And Mann has pondered it more than most. One of his greatest concerns is having to explain to his own daughter, a year behind mine in state college schools, her children and her grandchildren, why we failed to avert the catastrophe that is unfolding. Archivists play an important role in communicating with future generations. Anyone versed in historical research or archival literature will not consider this a penetrating insight. But I am going to take it one step further and try to suggest that we might also, through the records we select for preservation, tell a story that is fundamentally more respectful of the environment, perhaps helping to instigate a more ecocentric future for life on the planet, if not allow us simply to survive on it a little less despairingly. I have no idea whether this is likely, let alone plausible, but I think it's well worth our effort to reflect on it. For me, this is an exercise in hope. Hope, like the word work, is a four-letter word, but hope is hard work, and I use that word exercise carefully. And this is a space where we as archivists might reconcile our responsibility as stewards of cultural heritage with our responsibility as stewards of the world around us. So this exploration was inspired by an article published in 1993 by archivist Hugh Taylor called Recycling the Past, the Archivist in the Age of Ecology. His title refers to a quote by another archivist who argued for the cultural relevancy of archivists through their work to connect the recent past with present needs, rather than focusing too stridently on the remote past or speculating about distant future researchers. Taylor himself tries to connect this notion of relevancy to a spiritual understanding of human civilization and ecology, and he seems to have been largely inspired by eco-theologian Thomas Berry, who sought a more harmonious habitation of the planet, one that largely eschewed the trappings of American identity, especially our economic consumerism. In his book, The Great Work, Berry predicted a global transition to an ecocentric future through a reorientation of human endeavor around the natural world. And in a characteristic quote from the book, one of many that reminded me of archives and libraries, he asked, "After centuries of experiencing the planet as being a collection of objects for scientific analysis and commercial use, we must ask where we can find the resources for a reevaluation of our activities." Cultural and civic institutions, including universities and, one might suppose, libraries, were for very central locales to stage that reevaluation. So I admit I've come to appreciate Taylor's article less in the months since I submitted the proposal for this talk. Though notable for being one of the few professional essays to locate archival work within environmental thought, it is a sometimes rambling tour of topics ranging from cosmology and the nature of theory to virtual reality and archival anxieties about technical automation. He concludes with a vision of the future that sounds naive to our modern sensibilities, where governments are decentralized and attentive to the needs of their citizens, where work and play have become indistinguishable, and societies no longer even require environmental regulation. Despite these misfires, Taylor makes a convincing case that archives have a role to play in Barry's ecocentric future, and there's one foundational idea expressed that to my mind warrants greater consideration. It is the concept of planetary evidence and our role in preserving it. That the extent to which records have a bearing on the natural world should be one of the first considerations in archival appraisal. For those unfamiliar with archival appraisal, it refers to the act of determining whether a record has permanent historical value. In essence, appraisal decisions made today determine what will remain as the representation of contemporary society. Archivists decide every day which records to preserve, which to let rot, which to keep, which to discard, and these decisions are inherently fraught, what archivist Mark Green has called the fractious, messy, contingent nature of the shaping of the historical record. So one might think that such a solemn responsibility would result in professional consensus about how to do it. But as Green has repeatedly reminded us, archivists are both obsessed with and baffled by appraisal. The professional literature over recent decades seems to largely agree that modern society produces so much documentary material so quickly that passively waiting for material to come to us and accepting everything that does come is no longer, if it ever was, feasible. Yet in practice, many archivists still make appraisal decisions by gut. We all know them. And many archives still acquire collections without formal collecting strategies in place. Much of the literature on appraisal from the last 30 years is haunted by the specter of technology, which promised then and has probably now fulfilled a scale and complexity of records creation that defies our professional thinking, practices, and resources. Many authors writing during this time are uncomfortably nostalgic about the way that organizations controlled the creation, management, and dissemination of records for most of the past century. I'm not sure technology has solved these problems, but appraisal is certainly harder in a contemporary society that rapidly deploys new technology in myriad forms of media and indiscriminately creates and duplicates information, which only makes the necessity of it more urgent. Archivist Candace Lowen perhaps put it best when she said, "If we continue to wallow in the morass of endless information, our uninformed, haphazard appraisal choices will not leave an archival legacy which would help to form a well-rounded, true image of society." A first step toward mitigating professional anxieties about appraisal might be to define what we mean by planetary evidence. For Taylor, this included public records, observations, and diaries of those who are deeply observant of their communities, records of environmental activists, and business archives which reveal greening strategies. Remember, he's writing in 1993. A more nuanced definition is found in Candace Lowen's article, From Human Neglect to Planetary Survival, New Approaches to the Appraisal of Environmental Records, which correlated the deplorable state of the environment with the deterioration of archival appraisal. Lowen defined environmental records as those records which reveal the age-old human desire to monitor, control, and forecast unpredictable nature, including the actual data marshaled to support these aims. Lowen also asserted the value of preserving these records so that future generations have some level of understanding derived from the historical record and its context of creation as to how the planet attained its present state. In Lowen's definition, we can begin to perceive a continuum of environmental records that stretches back from today back thousands of years and includes, for example, the material aggregations of the natural world found in ice cores, tree rings, peat bogs, and sediment layers, or atmospheric data collected by satellites. Scientists collect, analyze, interpret, and document these records in the form of what we call research data. Viewed this way, we can understand the recent work of Data Refuge and the Environmental Data Governance Initiative as an effort in archiving planetary evidence. They are helping the public to connect notions of preservation and cultural memory with the domain of scientific data in a way that archivists have not. Their efforts to develop federal agency primers and document everyday uses of this data also realizes Candace Lowen's vision for better appraisal through an understanding of the full context of environmental records creation and their uses, both within and without the creating community. And while I'm grateful that thousands of concerned citizens across the country have come together to build this network, the fact that archivists weren't central to this work or deeply engaged in the effort suggests we haven't really heeded Lowen's call. Lowen is more expansive than Taylor in conceptualizing planetary evidence. In addition to scientific data, her definition includes documentation of environmental disasters themselves and the resulting impact on communities. The nuclear meltdowns at Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island weighed heavy in her writing. Public policy records and sustainability strategies, which I take to mean, for example, documenting societal responses like recycling or carbon sequestration. Underlying all these examples is her assertion that records do more than provide evidentiary historical research value, which is the traditional focus of archival appraisal. They potentially enable the survival of humans and the health of the environment in the future. She's also careful to call on archivists to create an inclusive documentary record, one that contains underdocumented alternative and protest groups, in her words. From an archival perspective, such records provide meaningful context to data. For instance, how watershed pollution, as quantified through scientific measurement, actually impacted the environment and the people living in it. Hugh Taylor predicted that future generations would value this archival legacy as evidence of humanity's heroic efforts to avoid disaster. In the 25 years since, humanity has concentrated in the Earth's atmosphere another 50 parts per million of carbon and likely crossed a threshold into climatic feedback loops, where reversing of the trajectory of emissions is not truly feasible. The documentary legacy we are more likely to leave is one that illuminates human insecurity, instability, and decline. And in light of this, we should take care to remember that communities we often simplistically define as underdocumented may well be the same communities most threatened by the effects of climate change. And documenting all of this will require us to overcome our own biases. Even Hugh Taylor was sensitive to this, reminding us that we are children of the industrial age, trying to document and facilitate whatever it is that comes next. So if you're with me so far, you might be wondering if cultural amnesia might be a more appealing option for future generations. I think that's come up today already. Kenneth Foote reminds us that archives function as part of a cooperative cultural memory network that is shaped by societal pressures to both preserve and destroy history. Society must find a way, for example, to recall across countless generations that radioactive waste is dangerous to human and environmental health. But society also sometimes desires to immediately efface painful memories of tragedy and great violence. And both choices, to remember or forget, are often functions of power. The danger we face is that climate change will be so horrifying our institutions of power will resist efforts to document it, or we as citizens, or we as archivists will choose simply to ignore it, when what may help us survive and adjust is carefully choosing what is worth remembering. So my goal here has not been to explore how archivists can become better at appraisal, but how we might overcome our historical shortcomings as selectors, especially around the environment, to begin documenting what writer David Orr has called the defining issue of our time: whether, how, and under what terms the human experiment will continue. Unlike Taylor and Lowen, I don't want to propose a list of groups or topics we should prioritize, similar to what Rick mentioned. Instead, I'll try to offer up a possible framework for archivists to consider, and then maybe conversations can grow out of this later. Yesterday, I heard Jason Kelly of IUPUI's Rivers of the Anthropocene project describe the science of the Anthropocene as planetary in scale, representing what he calls a phase shift in Earth systems. But the lived experience of the Anthropocene is different in every community. It is very local. Building on this idea, I want to suggest that archivists should become more engaged in coordinating across institutions and disciplines the preservation of something like environmental data. At the same time, archivists should be responsive to their local setting when trying to preserve the lived experience of individuals and communities inhabiting the natural world around them. To do this wisely, we might consider spending more time listening to those communities, pondering how climate change actually impacts them, and thinking about their future needs. We may even wish to engage thinkers in other disciplines that can help us think through what is worth preserving. I think a colloquium like this is a great way to do that. In reflecting on these possibilities, we'll need to remember that our collections are in fact a product of the system of economic exploitation that is responsible for our environmental crisis. The knowledge we preserve is inscripted on paper, plastic, and metals that are industrially harvested from the natural world, manufactured and refined, and then housed in climate-controlled buildings and data centers that are themselves powered by fossil fuels. Every decision to acquire or preserve something is essentially a commitment to put some amount more carbon into the Earth's atmosphere. This reality should probably prompt a meaningful, though difficult, conversation about whether the survival of knowledge into the distant future will be primarily dependent on deliberately preserving less of it. The writer Barry Lopez has said that stories offer patterns of sound and association, of event and image. Suspended as listeners and readers in these patterns, we might reimagine our lives. It is through story that we embrace the great breadth of memory, that we can distinguish what is true, and that we may glimpse, at least occasionally, how to live without despair in the midst of the horror that dogs and unhinges us. Archives are not stories, but they help us tell stories, and I'd like to think that they share some of the same patterns of knowing and thinking that Lopez describes. And if they do, then maybe archives can in some small way help interrupt the despair future generations will fill or shift the three prongs in Michael Mann's Venn diagram ever so slightly in the planet's favor. Thank you.
We have time for questions and answers now. So should we have the speakers come to the front? And we're going to go till 12:05. And we're providing lunch. Some people were asking about that. So we'll have time to talk over a meal back in the entryway. I'm just going to begin, just to jump in. Jill, I have a very just practical question. What do you do in terms of getting permission from your letter writers?
So we have an online consent form. So every person who participates has to state that they're willing to give us the material and to be used in non-commercial ways. And then we have the ability to kind of edit it and to use it from then on. And so that's something that it's actually very easy for individuals, because then when people submit, they're agreeing to that. It is a challenge for us now that we're finding that groups of people are doing the project. And so it's something that we're currently working through.
I have a quick question. First of all, thank you for all the presenters. I thought this was a very interesting panel, and I learned quite a lot, including a bunch of things I'd forgotten because of my impending dotage. My question is in some respects for the first and last presenters, but anybody can chime in. I wonder, as you mentioned, the sort of some of the problematics of archiving. You both hinted on various aspects of it, and one, of course, is the fact that it does have a sort of an endemic limitation in the sense that I'm asking this not as necessarily an archivist but an activist. If somebody wants to get their work relating to either climate change or some aspect of the future in terms of resistance out there, but then not necessarily have it restrict to an archive. So I guess my question is, how do you feel about things like sort of a kind of like a sort of a guerrilla archiving, shall we say? To give you a quick example, something I'm planning to do myself is to kind of edit an anthology on this topic, teaching for the post-Anthropocene or something in terms of a title like that. And of course, I wanted to go through the regular publishing gatekeepers and end up in so-called legitimate archives. Lexington Books are one of the other big ones if possible. But I also do something like actually buy a whole bunch of copies myself with my own money and then actually just give it to people. Individuals, which sounds like a crazy idea, but, well, I would be the editor, so that's already a crazy idea. I wonder how you feel about this sort of thing, and I wonder if you actually, in some respect, even advocate circumventing official archiving.
Totally. I mean, but you know, but there's an interaction between the official and the established archives and other kinds of repositories. You know, most of the smart and exciting ideas that have happened in this field have come from the periphery, not from the center. We don't look necessarily to major national institutions for, and also these days also archives especially are incubators of theory as well as appropriators of theory. A lot of really important, you know, critical race theory, queer theory, thoughts about gender are coming out of archives now, and I think we're going to start seeing that. I think we're going to start seeing thoughts about the, you know, ways to think about the environment. A lot of this will be generated within archives. I mean, by any means necessary.
I'll just say that in interference, I think that there's always this tension between sort of this idea of like an anti-capitalist prefigurative space and the fact that we are like in the real world and we have to like have a space that we pay money for, and you know that we have to take donations, but we want to make sure that those donations are not coming from people that are supporting things that we disagree with. So I think that there's always this tension even when you're working outside of an institutional space, right? You can never get outside. Like there is no outside, right? So that's something that I always try to keep in mind, because sometimes you're sort of like, okay, like I'm doing this thing that feels like it's outside of this space, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge the ways that we're really not outside of it, even when we're outside of an institution.
So I am in an institution of great power. And I'll just say that I think it'd be useful for those of us who are in institutions to help the community circumvent us in useful ways.
Anybody else?
I have a question for Aruna about collecting environmental or publications from environmental groups in politically endangered ecosystems. You didn't get a chance to say whether the archive you're collecting is in the United States or in India, and how do you cope with the political endangerment of the information?
Thank you. That's a very good question, because it's very relevant to you know, people's sensitivities, their lives, and the political environment. So the first part is the project that I am talking about, and even though there are various resources that these organizations produce, including, you know, physical objects, banners, posters. The one I have worked, and the one example I was about to show is it's a particular part of NGO website, which is like NGO reports. So they're already out on the website, and these are research reports or annual reports. So for that, it's not like these communities are much endangered, because it's already out there for everyone. And when we archive them, we also have a provision where if anyone has any objection, they can get back to us, just like the Columbia University's Human Rights Archives project policy. We are also using that, where if anyone has any objection, we'll take it down. So that is one part, like where we are taking out from the website itself. The second thing is and of course the NGOs I'm talking about are mainly from South Asia. And just to supplement what I'm getting from the NGOs from South Asia, I'm also supplementing them with you know, other think tanks or international organizations that have their funding and support to some of these NGOs in India. They work together. They're international organizations, but they also produce documents like this. So I'm collecting them as well. So that is one part. And when it comes to protecting the sensitivities and privacies of the people that are impacted by these and who are activists, like, maybe not big organizations but grassroots level. And the example would be doing oral histories of these activists at the ground level, and you go and talk to them. I go, or somebody else collects those oral history interviews, and they are there on the web. So whoever is putting on the web, they have to pay attention to their sensitivities and privacies. And I'm not doing oral history project of this kind myself, but if I do that, I would definitely pay attention. The first priority would be to pay attention to their privacies and safety. And of course, disclaimers and all is a second part, but the first concern should be it's my responsibility as a human being, and then as an archivist or as an oral historian, is to protect their interests first. Did I answer you?
Hi, Fred Stoss from the University of Buffalo. I've a brief question for Jill and an observation and a question for Ben. Jill, have you been doing any outreach or working with Mothers Out Front, mobilizing for a livable climate?
Yes. So there's 3 main groups in the U.S. that work with parents on climate change. And Mothers Out Front is one of them. They come out of Massachusetts. There's Moms Clean Air Force, which we work really closely with, and then there's one on the West Coast called Climate Parents, and there's also a new network that's emerging called the Elders Climate Network for grandparents. And I just thinking about this, so we do work with the parent movement. There is a growing kind of parent movement around climate change, but we also work with lots of different kinds of communities, because what we find is that the parental narrative actually goes across a lot of social and political boundaries in ways that other narratives don't. And then so you get, a story that comes out of the faith-based community is going to talk about, it could be like love thy neighbor as thyself, or it could be protecting, God's creation, and along with the love for their children. It's very different than the environmental justice community would have a narrative around being on the front lines of, fossil fuel plant or mountaintop removal or on a coastline, and even like somebody in the Republican Party talking about how to kind of rethink like why they care and why their party should really pay attention and not like that they're resisting the solutions, but not to resist the problem as part of political action. So, we do find that there's a lot of different groups, and I think I didn't really get into this, but we have this kind of theory that the best people to tell the stories are people within their own communities, and then to be the messenger with the message in their own communities. And so our platform, it's like anybody can do it, any organization or group can do the project.
Okay, Ben, back in 2011, the National Biological Information Infrastructure was very suddenly shuttered, and all of their data was turned off on January 18th of 2012. And we're now seeing that apart from what's happened with the election, that the Carbon Dioxide Information Analysis Center at Oak Ridge National Lab is going to be shutting its doors permanently at the end of this fiscal year. The EPA was just had its climate data shuttered. So we're seeing a lot of our traditional places where at least federally sponsored research and data are being severely threatened. And the one thing that I have primarily of concern deals with, I've got a very big science background in my thing, so it comes from a science perspective, that the Global Change Master Directory is essentially a metadata record of about 35,000 data sets pertaining to global environmental change, including climate change. It just gives an import to how incredibly large the effort is going to be to preserve an archive, and right now rescue threatened, very, very real threatened data. And I was just wondering if you had any perspectives on where can we turn, or where can librarians and archivists turn in terms of being able to be part of that rescue effort?
Well, I don't know if I have good answers. So I attended 2 data refuge events early in the year, and I would just say one thing that was noticeable about those events was how small the percentage of librarians were in the overall makeup of the attendees, which was disappointing to me. Certainly there's lots of librarians that have been involved, but I think just being there at the table and hearing everyday citizens and scientists and PhD students and technologists like working through the troubles was so illuminating. And I don't know like if they've actually archived in all those data rescue events like more than 10 terabytes of data or 5 terabytes. I mean, it's probably like a fraction of what the overall data that could be preserved or is possibly threatened. But yeah, I would say just like getting involved and being in conversations with the people who are creating the data and who need it and who are using it in different ways. Data Refuge is actually embarking on a new advocacy campaign to start doing storytelling around everyday uses of climate data to like really connect it to people, so it's not just like, you know, bleeding heart liberal academics who use this stuff. It's like farmers and entomologists and, you know, people who deal with public health and drive trains, you know, through weather. So I guess just engagement would be my answer.
So one thing I'm interested in is, you know, we were talking about institutional context, right? And like we're never actually outside. We all have to go back to our particular contexts. And so I guess I found Aruna's example particularly compelling because you're working from an academic library, but like incorporating the NGO websites into like a pre-existing framework, right? Into DSpace and WorldCat, but maybe even more compellingly into the collection development policy that, you know, is already, you're adding it to or making it part of the story that we're already telling, right? So I'm just curious about other strategies, right, on how to do that sort of work. You know, thoughts on collection development policies, but also things, you know, Ben, you talked a bit about our carbon footprint just as a profession. So like environmental strategies and even like, you know, the practice of weeding, which, you know, I'm usually a proponent of weeding in the context of my academic library, but if we're actually talking about like the, you know, the disappearance of culture on the planet, like do we want to, do we have perhaps unwarranted faith in the survival of those items that we're weeding from our collection? So huge question, so obviously can't be answered just right now, but I just would be interested in any of the speakers expounding a bit on some of the additional strategies we can actually incorporate into the places that we return to.
One thing that's been striking me lately, and I'm not a professional librarian, so I see this from the outside, but there's been some tradition of decisions about acquisition and deaccessioning taken with consultation to people involved. I mean, if it's only professors on a campus, and that tradition is really gone. Most recently, my university thinned out its science and engineering library to create a learning commons. And of the books that were gone, 14,000 of them were not held at any other UC campus, so they're not in the shared repositories. This fact just came out the other day. And we know about public library issues like that. And, you know, yes, when you consult, you're going to run into a lot of people who may be who may be nostalgic, but there's ways to deal with those issues, I think, and also acquisition. I mean, you know, you're doing acquisition and consultation with the communities that you work with. We try to do it too with our library. It's an amazing process, and I think it's a question of outreach more than thinking just internally, among other things.
I also think it's really a question of use and context. Like, to me, that's really important. Like, if we're just saving everything and we have these like moral quandaries about like our own carbon footprint, or like where the balance between like how much we save and how much is lost, or like what narrative we're saving, I think that, you know, we have to just think about the use of that and how that material kind of goes out there. And I know like some examples of sort of non-traditional collections that have made their way into institutional spaces lately. Like I've been interested less in the fact that that has happened and more in the way that those collections have been contextualized within those institutional spaces. Like what is the way that are they being absorbed to some kind of institutional framework, or are they being presented in a way that's counter-institutional even within the institutional space? So to me, those two things really I think are important questions to ask. And I think a lot of us are going to find that we're constrained by whatever practical constraints we have. In interference, one of our constraints is that we are open stacks, and we don't collect a lot of fragile things. Like we won't take your papers because we want people to be able to handle the materials and go in the archive and use them. So we only collect things that are multiples, which is like not an archival sort of thing. But because our consideration is about the community and the context and use more than, preservation, which is a different sort of animal indeed.
Okay, so I'll admit this is not a question. I feel really bad, but there's been so much talk about data rescue. I wanted to make everybody, I wanted to let you know because it doesn't say anywhere on my bio. I'm actually the Director of Legal Research for the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. It's a volunteer effort, so I don't think of it. My name is Sarah Lambden, so come talk to me. I've desperately been trying to get librarians and archivists involved in the efforts for months now. There's one other librarian involved in EDGI, one, and we would love, so if there are people who wonder how to get more involved in this data rescue aspect of the environmental information, please come and talk to me. I've been dying to meet all of you for a long time. So yeah, Sarah Lambden, talk to me, email me. I'd be happy, because what I would envision eventually is that we have a team of librarians trying to figure out how to best make this data accessible, which I know is not as much of a concern for the people who are collecting the data, but is a huge concern for people like us who are involved with the access to data issues. So. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I missed your name. Could you repeat it so that I can email you?
Yes, yay. Sarah Lambden, Lamdan. My bio, I work at CUNY, and that's another thing. Hey, all you CUNY people, amazing. I work at the law school, which is kind of like a weird, small, special library, but we love the work that CUNY does, and I follow all of you guys on Twitter. So, yay. Get involved, and a way to get involved would be to email me.
Sure, great.
Get contact.